All right, in this video, I'm going to kind of go through chapters 13, 14, and 15 and try to give you kind of a big overview of how many of the concepts that we're talking about fit together. So as you recall, chapter 13 is about cultures kind of clashing on the frontier. We've got Native Americans and white culture kind of coming into more increasing contact, which is going to lead to more increasing tensions and some violence. So if we look at Native American versus white culture, if we look at Native Americans, we talked about the buffalo being vital to their survival. And when Europeans later come into contact with Native Americans and they trade guns and horses, that allows them to hunt the buffalo much better, much more efficiently. We also mentioned kind of briefly how family was important to Native American cultures and kind of some of the things they believed in. The major difference, and I forgot to write it on here, between Native American and white culture is the idea of land ownership. And if you recall, that's going to lead to many of the tensions between the Native Americans and white settlers, where white settlers thought that owning land or land could be owned and then working to improve it. You're kind of staking a claim in the country. Native Americans kind of did not believe that land could be owned. They thought it was used in common. And so those two very different views lead to tensions. But if we look at white settlers and why they moved westward, we mentioned a lot of them were going there for riches. They were going there for some economic opportunity. We had the gold rush in California, later in Colorado, that pulls people to the west. We also mentioned briefly that some people were looking to kind of escape something that was going on back home, whether it be the law, whether it be, whatever. But most were going there for some sort of economic opportunity, which led to these mining towns kind of being developed, and they were not nice places to be. But the government also began to encourage settlement to the west, whether it be with the Homestead Act, which was kind of the big early on push to settle the frontier, where the government actually offered, I think it's 160 acres of land to a head of household, and all you had to do was move there, build a dwelling, and work to improve it. And you got free land. We had many exodusters, or that's another one of your vocab terms, African Americans that will take advantage of this Homestead Act to escape some of the conditions in the post-war South. The government didn't stop there with encouraging settlement. We had the Morrill Act, which was about educating. The Morrill and the Hatch Act were about educating frontier farmers so they could more successfully farm on the plains. Because remember, the Great Plains environment created a much different landscape. It was a much different situation for farmers and for white settlement. And so we talk about in class we mentioned this three legs metaphor, where east of the Mississippi, the society stood on three legs: timber, land, and water. Well, if you move west of the Mississippi, you kind of remove two of those legs, water and timber. And so there's all kinds of adaptations that need to be made in order for life on the plains to be hospitable, I guess, so to speak. You had things like dugouts and soddies. That was a way to overcome the lack of timber. There were different farming innovations, such as the steel plow, that enabled farmers to work the land much easier. And so all along, government is encouraging some settlement on the plains. But with that settlement, like we mentioned earlier, comes conflict with Native Americans. And so we have all these incidences in chapter 13, section 1, where it mentions where white settlers came into conflict with Native Americans, whether it be the massacre at Sand Creek, which again is kind of the one of the first big incidences of conflict between Native Americans and white settlers. Violence continued until the United States government and the Native Americans signed the Treaty of Fort Laramie. Remember, under the terms of that treaty, Native Americans, mainly the Sioux, were supposed to stay on their reservation. In return, the United States government would kind of respect that. However, when we would look at the Treaty of Fort Laramie, excuse me, the Sioux would stay on the reservation. The United States would then close the Bozeman Trail. However, that didn't happen, and the Sioux didn't really abide by the terms of that treaty, because remember, they still expected to be able to hunt the buffalo, and they went out and kind of followed the buffalo around. And so we still had a great amount of conflict, to the point where we have an incident known as Custer's Last Stand. Remember George Custer and his men, they were all killed by Native Americans at Custer's Last Stand. Sitting Bull is a Native American that he's a leader at Custer's Last Stand. He's kind of a significant player in the ordeal. But the significance of Custer's Last Stand is it kind of continues to increase anti-American sentiment when they hear of Custer and all his men being killed. Finally, this leads to an act or a battle at Wounded Knee, which takes place at the Little Bighorn Creek, where again the ultimate outcome of this is the defeat of the Native Americans, and it kind of ends Native American resistance on the frontier. So a significant aspect to Wounded Knee. All of this kind of leads to the changing of the United States policy towards Native Americans. Remember, we went one from of removal to one of trying to negotiate some treaties individually with one of with tribes, to now a policy of assimilation, basically, where we tried to assimilate Native Americans to white culture. And that was really put into place under the Dawes Act, where they wanted to Americanize Native Americans. And that had a pretty drastic effect. That, along with the destruction of the buffalo. White settlers had began to hunt the buffalo for sport, also for their resources, but the buffalo population just completely is devastated, and really that, coupled with the Americanization movement, leads to basically the end of Native American cultures on the frontier. So it's pretty significant there. The last thing we looked at in chapter 13 was the populist movement. And remember, farmers were in debt. We talked about how farming was expensive. They oftentimes had to borrow money to buy their farm equipment, and there's all kinds of problems in the farming economy, where basically farmers were producing more because the prices were falling, but the more they produced, the more prices fell. And so in farmers' minds, they had a couple of enemies. One was the railroads, who continually charged differential rates. They charged them higher rates than farmers in the East, so it cost them a lot to get their goods to market, which again, oftentimes to offset that difference, they would try to produce even more, which again would cause prices to fall even further, which means that they felt they had to ship even more. So it's kind of that cycle. They also thought that the grain operators were an issue, because again, they would maybe give them or weigh their farm products at much lighter than what the farmer thought they were kind of in bed with the railroads. We talked about the banks being an issue for farmers because there's no regulation of interest rates, and so banks oftentimes charged outrageous rates. And there's also a sense that government is not really close to the people. It's too far removed, and only working for the interest of railroads. And so farmers begin to unite. First, it's Oliver Hudson Perry and his Grange movement, which is really more of a social movement of farmers, but it turns into this farmers alliance that begins to go out and actively speak out against the railroad, banks, interest rates, and those types of things. And they develop a platform that really looks to make some reforms to government and make some reforms to how things worked, as far as they called for things such as excuse me, I lost my train of thought there, but they called for things such as direct election of senators, a secret ballot. So those are some governmental reforms. They wanted to, and this is kind of a big one, they wanted to get off the gold standard. Farmers favored something called bimetallism. And bimetallism is just this idea that you can exchange your money for gold or silver. And that would place more money in circulation, which means farmers could get higher prices for their products. So that's kind of one of their big reforms. This is William Jennings Bryan, his Cross of Gold speech, about getting off the gold standard. So with this populist movement, 1892, they run their own presidential candidate of the Populist Party. He does not win, but he does win 10% of the popular vote, which is pretty significant for a third party. 1896 rolls around. William Jennings Bryan is the Democratic nominee. He's running against William McKinley. William McKinley wins. He's got more resources. And with McKinley's election, this pretty much brings about the collapse of populism. People in populism had kind of lost its support in cities where people feared inflation. And again, with McKinley's election, populism kind of ends. However, there is a significant legacy to it. First, it shows that people could unite, but secondly, it shows that, secondly, a lot of the reforms the populists were calling for ended up being put into effect later on. So a lot of the reforms that the populists called for will be adopted by one of the other major parties and eventually put into place. Okay, so if we look at chapter 14 now, we're now turning our focus and looking more at the industrialization that was taking place at this time too. So we've got, yes, this frontier movement going on and growth on the frontier, but we also have a new industrial age. And if we look at some of our long-term and short-term causes of this big business boom from 1880 to 1914, we need to go back and look at things that were going on in this country long-term. We had an abundance of natural resources. Again, not something we might necessarily see in our country today, but we did have an abundance of natural resources. First, it's oil, and as oil processes become much more efficient, like with the Bessemer process, oil is going to turn into a huge energy source. We also had the ability early on to harness early power sources such as water and coal, which again allowed us to have the infrastructure to kind of industrialize. The invention of the steam engine as well, and then for a great deal of time in this country, we were building roads and canals and railroads that kind of connected the country together. These are all things you would need in order for a business boom to take place. Also, if we were to look at some immediate causes, we have the expansion of the railroads in the late 1800s, and so that really starts to unite the country together. It means you can move goods throughout the country a lot easier. We also have a cheap labor supply at this time in the country, and chapter 15 kind of mentions that. We've got immigrants coming into the country that are living in cities looking for jobs. We also have, as a farming becomes much more mechanized. You have farmers moving out of rural areas into cities. So you have a great deal of labor. You have a ready supply of labor. You also have a burst in technological innovations during this time period. And so, again, with that, that's going to allow you to produce things much more efficiently, much better. We have things like the telegraph we mentioned, the incandescent light bulb, the electricity was harnessed, and so when you do those things again, it's going to allow you to produce things more efficiently. Um, we also mentioned, in this chapter, the new management techniques and business strategies that enabled businesses to grow and expand their influence. So these would be things like vertical integration, horizontal integration, trust, and kind of the ability of guys like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller to consolidate and really grow their power. And again, if business has more power, you can kind of see where they might be able to grow and expand and really boom because they're not really checked by anything. Um, and again, you also have this investment in capital where people started to invest their money in these businesses, which again can lead to this business boom. So if we look at some immediate and long-term effects of the business boom, we've got the growth of the large corporations. And so we talked about Andrew Carnegie, his United Steel, John D. Rockefeller, and Standard Oil, some of these big businesses that grew, and they grew out of basically the fact that government kind of took a hands-off approach. Remember we talked about social Darwinism and how that was a means for companies to kind of, or for countries to, or for the United States, sorry, to practice a laissez-faire, a hands-off approach. And so these corporations grew very strong. And then when they did try to check it, like with the Sherman Antitrust Act, the law wasn't strong enough. And so, a lot of these companies weren't prosecuted under antitrust laws. So we have these large corporations. You also have an era of, for better or for worse, new and plentiful manufactured goods, because as these companies mass produce things, people are mass buying them. However, that leads to its own set of issues. We've got poor working conditions because these companies had gotten so big, government wasn't regulating them. There wasn't any regulation on any working conditions that you might have. And so, there's just poor pay, long work weeks. We talked about child labor being an issue. And so, because there's poor working conditions, that gives rise to a whole nother movement, the labor movement, where labor unions are going to start to work to try to improve their stocks. We talked about craft unions. We talked about industrial unions and Eugene V. Debs. We also talked about socialism a little bit in this section with the industrial workers of the world and kind of some things they did. Eventually, the labor movement does make some headway, but it's slow and it's a slow go early on. We also mentioned women's role, and this was a question, I believe, on one of your worksheets, your Section 3 worksheet from Chapter 14, where when we look at the role women played, women were instrumental in really ending child labor. And so there's a couple of things that are mentioned under this section, but remember, Mary Harris Jones led that march of maimed children to Theodore Roosevelt's house, and really shows Theodore Roosevelt the evils of child labor, and so child labor really gets curbed after that, and then also the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in New York City brings a call to reform some conditions in factories after 146 women died. So you're going to kind of see, those long-term effects. again, it takes a while for unions to make headway. The oftentimes companies would refuse to recognize unions' collective bargaining rights. They would make employees promise not to sign a union or join a union by signing a yellow dog contract. So again, it takes a while. It's kind of slow and steady in that respect. So that's kind of a quick and dirty summary of Chapter 14. If we look at Chapter 15, we're looking at immigrants and urbanization. And this should look familiar to some of you. Chapter 15 is kind of the thing we've done most recently. But when we look at immigration and migration, we've got immigration in this country, people from, mainly Europe, Eastern Europe, Western Europe, and Asia that come to this country, and they're generally coming for some sort of opportunity. Some are escaping persecution, but most of them are seeking economic opportunities or that American dream. So on the one hand, we've got these immigrants coming into the country. On the other hand, you have farmers and that are moving into cities because they are trying to make a living. They no longer have jobs on farms because farms have become mechanized. So you have these things going on. Immigrants to this country oftentimes faced some discrimination. They are looking at, they're kind of caught in the middle. Yes, a lot of them want to be what it is to be American, but at the same time, they want to hold on to their culture. So you have those competing views going on. You also have some anti-immigration sentiment in the United States. There's the nativism movement, and nativists favored native-born people, and so there's some immigration or some discrimination that way. So you've got some issues. Most of these immigrants and most of these people that lived on farms that no longer can find labor on farms move into cities in the Northeast and the Midwest, which causes a population boom in cities. And so city services such as housing, transportation, water, sanitation, they're stretched to the limit, and cracks begin to emerge, and we kind of have to, as a country, look at ways for dealing with those problems. And so we've got reformers trying to fix a lot of these problems that the urban poor faced. Things like education training, usually provided through some sort of a social service program. We've got the social gospel movement, the settlement houses, and those types of things. Jane Addams, those are all important things to note under this urbanization as they tried to really address some of the problems of the urban poor. Politically, though, we've got these political machines that developed to take advantage of the needs of the immigrants and the urban poor. And city politicians oftentimes used graft and fear and those types of things to increase their political power. We also have corruption at the national level in our politics with things like patronage, the practice of patronage, which leads to the call for for civil service reform. And then finally, with big business, how it gotten so big, it had gone unchecked for a long time. Big business's growing influence on politics basically makes tariff reform pretty much impossible. And again, tariff reform would have aided our everyday workers. So there's some issues there as well. So when you're done watching this video, you should go ahead and give a look to the next video. I'm going to go over the answers for most of the worksheet questions.